The morning sun cast sharp shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morrison, Klein and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. The 23rd floor conference room reeked of old money and intimidation, its mahogany table polished to mirror perfection and surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Crystal water glasses caught the light like diamonds, and the air itself seemed to whisper of power and consequence. Before we dive into this story of assumptions and shocking revelations, I'm curious about our viewers today. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in a cozy living room, perhaps during your lunch break at work, or maybe listening while commuting? Drop a comment and let me know your location and what you think about people who make dangerous assumptions about others. Your perspectives from different places always add such richness to these stories. David Thornfield strode into the conference room like a man who owned the world, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with practiced arrogance. At 45, he had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, and his navy suit tailored to emphasize his still athletic frame. Behind him glided Victoria Castellano, 28 years of calculated beauty poured into a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded in perfect waves, her emerald eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered her prey. Victoria's red-soled heels announced her arrival like a declaration of war. She surveyed the conference room with the air of someone already measuring for new curtains, her gaze lingering on the expensive artwork with obvious approval. Her perfectly manicured fingers, adorned with the 3-carat engagement ring David had given her just months after filing for divorce, drummed against her Hermes clutch in barely contained excitement. The couple settled into their chairs with theatrical flourish, David immediately loosening his tie as if the proceedings were merely a formality before his real life could begin. Victoria crossed her legs with deliberate precision, ensuring her dress rode up just enough to remind everyone in the room of exactly what David had traded his 24 marriage for. She leaned over to whisper something in his ear, both of them chuckling quietly as they eyed the empty chairs across the table. Minutes later, the conference room door opened with barely a whisper. Margaret Whitmore entered like an apology, her slight frame almost lost in a simple gray cardigan that had seen better years. Her brown hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that spoke of mornings spent caring for others rather than primping for conquests. She carried only a small manila folder and a worn leather purse that Victoria immediately noted was definitely not designer. At 51, Margaret had the kind of invisible quality that came from decades of putting everyone else's needs first. Her face, while naturally pretty, bore no trace of the cosmetic enhancements that kept women like Victoria perpetually camera-ready. She wore minimal makeup and sensible flats, looking every inch the devoted housewife that David's lawyer had already painted her as in preliminary documents. Margaret's attorney, Harold Pembroke, shuffled in behind her looking overwhelmed and underprepared. His rumpled suit and nervous energy stood in stark contrast to David's high-powered legal team, led by the shark-like Miranda Cross, who could smell weakness from 3 blocks away. Pembroke clutched a battered briefcase and kept checking his notes, as if expecting them to change when he wasn't looking. Victoria's smirk grew wider as she took in Margaret's modest appearance. She leaned toward David again, her voice carrying just loud enough for Margaret to hear. She told him how much she was looking forward to redecorating their house, especially that dreadful kitchen with its outdated appliances and country decor. David nodded indulgently, his eyes never leaving Victoria's cleavage as she described her plans for a complete modernization. Miranda Cross spread her documents across the table with military precision, each paper positioned for maximum psychological impact. The settlement terms read like a complete capitulation, offering Margaret a minimal monthly allowance while transferring the $2.3 million family home, David's investment portfolio, and even the vintage Mercedes to David and his new bride-to-be. Margaret listened in silence as Miranda outlined how generous David was being, considering that Margaret had contributed nothing to their marriage except 22 years of housework and companionship. Victoria couldn't contain her delight, making soft sounds of approval at each cruel detail. When Miranda mentioned that Margaret would need to find alternative housing within 30 days, Victoria actually clapped her hands together softly. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with Victoria's barely contained glee. She began describing to David how she planned to gut the master bedroom first, claiming it held too many sad memories of his previous life. Margaret flinched slightly at the casual cruelty, but continued taking careful notes on a small yellow pad, her pen moving steadily across the paper. Harold Pembroke attempted several weak objections, but Miranda swatted them away like annoying insects. His client had signed a prenuptial agreement, she reminded him, though she conveniently forgot to mention that the house predated the marriage entirely. Victoria watched Margaret's lawyer stumble through his inadequate preparation with obvious satisfaction. As the morning wore on, Victoria's confidence reached stratospheric levels. She began openly discussing her timeline for moving her remaining belongings into the master suite, having already claimed the walk-in closet and private bathroom. She told David about the interior designer she'd already consulted, describing plans to replace Margaret's homey touches with sleek modern fixtures that would eliminate every trace of the previous occupant. Margaret remained silent through most of the presentation, occasionally asking Pembroke to clarify a detail or requesting a moment to review a particular clause. Her composure seemed to irritate Victoria, who had clearly expected tears or desperate pleading. Instead, Margaret simply nodded at appropriate moments and continued her methodical note-taking. The tension in the room built steadily as Victoria grew bolder in her commentary. She wondered aloud how someone could live in such a beautiful house for over 2 decades without making any real improvements. She speculated about what kind of person would let such valuable real estate stagnate under outdated decorating choices. Her voice dripped with disdain as she painted Margaret as a woman too simple to appreciate what she'd been given. David joined in the subtle mockery, reminiscing about how Margaret had always been too timid to entertain properly or take advantage of their social opportunities. He described her as sweet but limited, someone who preferred gardening to gala events and found board meetings intimidating. Victoria nodded sympathetically, as if David had been trapped by his own kindness in caring for someone so beneath his station. The morning reached its crescendo when Victoria finally addressed Margaret directly. She told her not to feel bad about losing the house, since Margaret had never really understood how to use it properly anyway. She assured Margaret that she and David would put the property to much better use, hosting the kind of sophisticated gatherings that befitted such an elegant address. Her voice carried false sweetness over a core of absolute steel. Margaret looked up from her notes for the first time in an hour, meeting Victoria's gaze with surprising steadiness. She thanked Victoria for her concern and assured her that everything would work out exactly as it should. Something in Margaret's tone made Victoria's smile falter for just a moment, but she quickly recovered her composure. As the settlement discussion neared its conclusion, Victoria delivered what she clearly intended as the final blow. She told Margaret that perhaps this was all for the best, since Margaret would finally be free to find housing more appropriate to her limited means and simple tastes. She suggested that Margaret might actually be happier in a small apartment where she wouldn't feel overwhelmed by space she couldn't properly utilize. The room fell silent except for the soft scratch of Margaret's pen against paper. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm and measured. She told Victoria that she appreciated the advice, and that everyone would indeed end up exactly where they belonged. The quiet confidence in her tone sent an unexpected chill through the room, though Victoria was too intoxicated by her approaching victory to fully register the warning. Victoria's patience finally snapped as she watched Margaret continue her methodical note-taking. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand against the mahogany table, the sharp crack echoing through the conference room like a gunshot. She declared that enough time had been wasted on this pathetic charade and demanded that Margaret sign the settlement papers immediately. Her emerald eyes blazed with irritation as she accused Margaret of deliberately stalling to avoid facing reality. The mask of sweet concern that Victoria had worn earlier completely dissolved, revealing the calculating predator beneath. She told Margaret to stop pretending that reviewing documents would somehow change the inevitable outcome. David was moving on with someone who actually deserved him, she announced, and Margaret needed to accept her new circumstances with whatever dignity she had left. Margaret looked up from her papers with that same unsettling calm, suggesting that perhaps they should ensure all details were absolutely correct before finalizing anything so important. Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless as she assured Margaret that every detail had been triple-checked by the best legal minds money could buy. She gestured dramatically toward Miranda Cross, who nodded with professional smugness. The story of how Victoria had orchestrated this entire situation began to unfold as she grew more confident in her victory. She had first noticed David at the country club 18 months ago, she revealed with obvious pride. While other women had been content to admire him from afar, Victoria had done her research. She had learned about his real estate investments, his stock portfolio, and most importantly, his growing dissatisfaction with his quiet home life. Victoria described her campaign to win David with military precision. She had positioned herself at his favorite restaurant during his regular lunch meetings, always alone and always reading something that would spark his interest. Investment magazines, architectural digests, anything that would mark her as a woman who understood his world. When he finally approached her table, she had been ready with intelligent conversation about market trends and property development. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, Victoria recalled with satisfaction. David had been starved for intellectual stimulation, she claimed, trapped in a marriage with someone who thought the stock market was where you bought groceries. Margaret's face remained carefully neutral as Victoria painted her as a woman too simple to understand her husband's sophisticated business dealings. The seduction had been systematic and ruthless. Victoria had made herself indispensable to David's professional life, attending networking events where Margaret felt uncomfortable and hosting dinner parties where important deals were discussed. She had gradually replaced Margaret in every aspect of David's public life, becoming the woman on his arm at gallery openings and charity galas. Victoria's voice grew dreamy as she described how David had finally confessed his feelings during a business trip to Chicago. He had told her that being with her felt like coming alive after years of sleepwalking through his marriage. She had played the reluctant other woman perfectly, expressing concern about his happiness while making it clear that she could offer him everything his current life lacked. The real estate portfolio that David thought he was bringing to their new life together particularly delighted Victoria. She had already researched the market value of each property, calculating her future net worth with the precision of a certified accountant. The lake house alone was worth $800,000, and she had plans to renovate it into the perfect romantic getaway for their new life together. But it was the main house that truly captured Victoria's imagination. She began describing her renovation plans in excruciating detail, each word designed to wound Margaret further. The dated country kitchen would be gutted completely, replaced with sleek German appliances and marble countertops that wouldn't look like they belonged in a farmhouse. The cozy reading nook where Margaret spent her evenings would become a sophisticated wine cellar worthy of David's collection. Victoria had already consulted with 3 different interior designers, she announced with obvious glee. The consensus was that the house had good bones but suffered from years of timid decorating choices. Everything would need to be replaced, from the worn Persian rugs that Margaret treasured to the family photos that cluttered every surface. Victoria wanted clean lines and dramatic spaces that would showcase David's success properly. The master bedroom renovation plans were particularly cruel in their detail. Victoria described how she would expand the space by combining it with Margaret's old sewing room, creating a suite worthy of a luxury hotel. The wallpaper with tiny flowers that Margaret had chosen during their first year of marriage would be stripped away, replaced with sophisticated neutral tones that photographed well for the magazine spread Victoria was already planning. David listened to these plans with growing excitement, his earlier discomfort at Margaret's presence fading as Victoria painted pictures of their glamorous future. He began adding his own suggestions, mentioning the home office expansion he had always wanted and the media room that would be perfect for entertaining clients. They spoke as if Margaret had already vacated the premises, their voices carrying across the conference table like casual cruelty. Harold Pembroke made several futile attempts to interject, but Victoria steamrolled over his objections with practiced ease. She reminded him that his client had signed away any rights to contest the settlement when she agreed to the prenuptial agreement. The document was ironclad, she declared, drafted by the same firm that had protected 3 generations of David's family wealth. Margaret continued taking notes throughout Victoria's victory speech, her pen moving steadily across the yellow legal pad. Occasionally, she would pause to ask Pembroke a quiet question, but she never attempted to defend herself against Victoria's increasingly vicious characterizations. Her silence seemed to fuel Victoria's confidence, encouraging even more detailed descriptions of Margaret's failures as a wife. The financial arrangements particularly pleased Victoria. David's monthly income from his investments alone exceeded what most people earned in a year, and she would finally have access to the kind of lifestyle she had always deserved. She described the European vacation they were planning for their honeymoon, a month-long tour of the finest hotels and restaurants that someone like Margaret could never appreciate. Victoria's cruelty reached new heights as she speculated about Margaret's future living arrangements. Perhaps a small apartment in the suburbs would be more suitable, she suggested with false concern. Something modest where Margaret wouldn't feel overwhelmed by space she couldn't properly maintain. She even offered to help Margaret find something appropriate, claiming she knew several real estate agents who specialized in budget housing. The transformation in Victoria's appearance during this victory lap was remarkable. Her earlier calculation gave way to pure malicious joy, her perfect features animated by the pleasure of watching her rival's destruction. She leaned back in her leather chair like a queen holding court, her voice growing more commanding with each passing minute. David's own transformation was equally striking. The guilt and discomfort he had shown earlier evaporated as Victoria reinforced his narrative of escape from an unsatisfying marriage. He began describing Margaret as sweet but limited, a woman who had been a suitable companion for his younger self but couldn't grow with him as his ambitions expanded. Margaret's apparent resignation only encouraged more detailed descriptions of her inadequacies. Victoria painted her as a woman frozen in time, content with simple pleasures while the world moved forward around her. She suggested that Margaret might actually be relieved to escape the pressure of maintaining a lifestyle she had never truly understood or embraced. The conference room atmosphere grew thick with Victoria's triumph and David's renewed confidence in his choices. Miranda Cross watched the proceedings with professional satisfaction, her clients clearly pleased with her work. Harold Pembroke looked increasingly defeated, his earlier attempts at advocacy reduced to nervous paper shuffling. As Victoria's monologue reached its crescendo, Margaret quietly raised her hand to request a moment to review one particular document. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive as she accused Margaret of grasping at straws. There was nothing left to review, she declared. The settlement was generous beyond what Margaret deserved, and any attempt to delay the inevitable was simply prolonging everyone's suffering unnecessarily. A soft knock interrupted Victoria's triumphant monologue, and the conference room door opened to reveal a distinguished gentleman in his 70s. Mr. Theodore Henderson entered with the quiet authority that comes from 40 years of handling the most sensitive legal documents in the city. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, his charcoal suit pressed to perfection, and he carried a leather briefcase that had witnessed more family secrets than most therapists. Mr. Henderson moved with deliberate precision, acknowledging each person in the room with a professional nod before setting his briefcase on the credenza with practiced care. His presence immediately shifted the room's energy, bringing an air of formal procedure that made even Victoria straighten slightly in her chair. This was clearly a man who took his responsibilities seriously, someone who had notarized everything from presidential pardons to celebrity divorce settlements. Victoria's impatience bubbled over immediately. She informed Mr. Henderson that they were ready to finalize everything right now, emphasizing that the settlement was straightforward and required no extensive review. Her fingers drummed against the table as she explained that Margaret had already agreed to all terms and was simply delaying the inevitable with unnecessary paperwork shuffling. Mr. Henderson opened his briefcase with methodical care, removing documents, stamps, and verification tools with the precision of a surgeon preparing for operation. He explained in his measured baritone that proper notarization required careful verification of all parties and documents, regardless of how straightforward the proceedings might appear. His tone was polite but firm, making it clear that he would not be rushed through his professional duties. Margaret spoke for the first time in nearly an hour, her voice soft but clear as she addressed the notary directly. She requested that Mr. Henderson verify the property ownership records before any documents were signed, explaining that she wanted to ensure complete accuracy in the final settlement. Her request was perfectly reasonable, yet it seemed to send a ripple of annoyance through David and Victoria. Victoria's emerald eyes flashed with irritation as she demanded to know why Margaret was suddenly concerned about property records. Everything had been verified months ago by David's legal team, she insisted. The house belonged to David, the investments belonged to David, and Margaret's only claim was to whatever monthly allowance the settlement provided. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone used to having her authority questioned. David joined Victoria's objections, assuring Mr. Henderson that his attorneys had thoroughly researched all property ownership issues during the divorce preparation. He gestured toward Miranda Cross, who nodded confidently while shuffling through her files. The house had been purchased during their marriage using funds from David's business ventures, making ownership a simple matter of marital property division. Mr. Henderson listened to these explanations with professional courtesy, but his expression remained neutral as he explained that verification was standard protocol regardless of preliminary research. He had learned through decades of experience that assumptions, even educated ones, could lead to significant legal complications. Better to confirm everything properly than discover oversights after documents were signed and filed. Margaret reached into her small manila folder and withdrew several documents, explaining quietly that she had brought what she believed were relevant ownership records. Her tone was apologetic, as if she were sorry for causing any inconvenience, but she felt it was important to have everything properly documented. The papers looked official, bearing various stamps and seals that suggested legal authenticity. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive as she accused Margaret of producing fake documents in a desperate attempt to delay her inevitable defeat. She told Mr. Henderson that Margaret had been stalling all morning, clearly hoping that some miracle would save her from facing reality. These papers were obviously either outdated or fabricated, she declared, waving her hand dismissively toward Margaret's folder. Miranda Cross leaned forward with predatory interest, demanding to examine whatever Margaret thought she had discovered. Her professional instincts were aroused by the possibility of uncovering Margaret's final desperate gambit, and she was eager to demolish whatever pathetic legal theory Harold Pembroke had constructed. She assured everyone that her research had been exhaustive and that no legitimate ownership issues existed. Mr. Henderson accepted Margaret's documents with the same professional courtesy he had shown everyone else, explaining that he would review all materials thoroughly before proceeding. His weathered hands handled the papers with practiced care, his eyes scanning the contents with the focused attention of someone trained to spot the smallest irregularities in legal documentation. Victoria's agitation grew as the notary spent several minutes reviewing Margaret's papers in silence. She began describing her renovation timeline again, emphasizing how much work needed to be done before she and David could properly settle into their new life together. The kitchen contractors were already scheduled, she announced, and the interior designer had blocked out the entire month of April for the master bedroom renovation. The tension in the room became palpable as Mr. Henderson continued his methodical examination. He cross-referenced Margaret's documents with the settlement papers, occasionally making soft humming sounds that suggested either approval or concern. His poker face revealed nothing, but his obvious attention to Margaret's materials sent ripples of unease through Victoria and David. Harold Pembroke attempted to explain the documents Margaret had provided, but his nervous energy and obvious lack of preparation made his explanations sound unconvincing. Miranda Cross interrupted him repeatedly, dismissing his amateur legal theories with the contempt of someone who had built her reputation on destroying exactly these kinds of desperate last-minute challenges. Victoria's composure began showing hairline cracks as the verification process stretched longer than expected. She reminded everyone that she had appointments with contractors and designers, important commitments that couldn't be delayed for Margaret's obvious stall tactics. Her voice carried a hint of shrillness that hadn't been there earlier, suggesting that Mr. Henderson's thoroughness was beginning to rattle her supreme confidence. Mr. Henderson requested additional documentation from Miranda Cross, specifically asking to see the original property deed and purchase records. His tone remained professionally neutral, but something in his manner suggested he had encountered discrepancies that required clarification. Miranda shuffled through her files with growing urgency, her earlier confidence showing signs of strain. David attempted to speed the process by offering to call his bank and provide whatever verification Mr. Henderson required. He emphasized that time was valuable for everyone involved and that prolonging the proceedings served no useful purpose. His voice carried the entitled impatience of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed through sheer force of personality and financial influence. Victoria snapped at Mr. Henderson directly, demanding to know why he was wasting everyone's time examining obviously fraudulent documents produced by a desperate woman facing homelessness. Her carefully maintained facade of sophisticated control was beginning to crack, revealing the calculating ruthlessness that lay beneath her perfect exterior. She accused him of being manipulated by Margaret's pathetic attempts to avoid signing the settlement. Margaret remained quietly composed throughout Victoria's outburst, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she watched the proceedings with an almost serene expression. Her earlier nervousness seemed to have completely evaporated, replaced by a stillness that suggested someone waiting patiently for an inevitable outcome. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Mr. Henderson finally looked up from his examination, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the room's occupants. He addressed his next question to the room in general, asking whose name appeared as the original purchaser on the property deed. The question hung in the air like a challenge, creating a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. Victoria's confident smile faltered for the first time all morning. Her perfect composure wavered as she realized that Mr. Henderson's question suggested something she had never considered possible. The foundation of her entire victory was suddenly feeling less solid than the mahogany table beneath her perfectly manicured hands. Mr. Henderson's voice cut through the conference room silence with the authority of absolute truth. According to the original property deed and all subsequent documentation, he announced, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore was listed as the sole owner of the property located at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. The house, purchased in full on March 15, 2001, had never been transferred to joint ownership or placed in David's name at any point during their marriage. Victoria's perfectly crafted mask shattered like crystal hitting concrete. Her emerald eyes went wide with disbelief as she lurched forward in her chair, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch as she declared this had to be some kind of mistake. She demanded that Mr. Henderson check his documents again, insisting that he had obviously mixed up files or been given fraudulent paperwork by Margaret's incompetent legal team. Margaret's transformation was immediate and profound. The meek, apologetic woman who had spent the morning being verbally abused straightened in her chair with quiet dignity. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a calm authority that no one in the room had heard before. She explained that she had purchased the house 2 years before her marriage using her inheritance from her grandmother's estate, a sum of $400,000 that had been invested wisely over the years. David's face drained of color as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he struggled to process the reality that the house he had been planning to give Victoria, the property he had assumed was his to dispose of, had never belonged to him at all. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Victoria's scream of outrage echoed off the conference room's mahogany paneling. She accused everyone present of participating in an elaborate conspiracy designed to rob her of what was rightfully hers. Her perfectly styled hair began to escape its pins as she gestured wildly, her designer dress twisting around her as she half rose from her chair in fury. The sophisticated socialite had completely disappeared, replaced by a woman whose carefully laid plans were crumbling before her eyes. Mr. Henderson remained unflappably professional as he continued his explanation. The documentation was absolutely clear and had been verified through multiple sources, including the county recorder's office and Margaret's bank records from the original purchase. The property had been bought outright with no mortgage, and the title had remained in Margaret's name throughout the entire marriage. There was no ambiguity whatsoever in the legal ownership. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she revealed the depth of her preparation. She had suspected David's affair for almost a year, she explained calmly, and had taken steps to protect herself legally and financially. She had consulted with 3 different attorneys, all of whom had confirmed that her premarital assets remained her separate property regardless of the prenuptial agreement David had insisted she sign. Miranda Cross frantically shuffled through her files, her professional composure cracking as she realized the magnitude of her oversight. Her reputation for thorough research was built on exactly the kind of verification she had somehow failed to perform in this case. She pulled out document after document, searching desperately for anything that would support her client's assumed ownership of the property. Victoria's hysteria escalated to new heights as she processed what Margaret's revelation meant for her carefully orchestrated future. She had already given notice on her apartment, she shrieked. Her belongings were sitting in boxes in what she had believed was now her house. The interior designer was expecting a deposit next week for renovations that would now never happen. Her entire life had been reorganized around a reality that had never existed. David found his voice long enough to stammer out confused questions about how this was possible. He had lived in the house for 22 years, he protested weakly. He had made mortgage payments, hadn't he? His bewilderment was complete as Margaret gently corrected him, explaining that there had never been a mortgage to pay. The house had been purchased outright, and the monthly payments he thought were going to a mortgage company had actually been going into a joint household account that Margaret managed. Mr. Henderson confirmed that his examination of the prenuptial agreement showed it covered only assets acquired during the marriage, not premarital property that remained in one spouse's individual name. The house, being purchased before the marriage and never transferred to joint ownership, remained Margaret's separate property regardless of any other agreements between the parties. Victoria's mind raced through the implications with calculating speed despite her emotional breakdown. Every plan she had made, every renovation she had described, every future she had envisioned was built on a foundation that had never existed. The 3-carat engagement ring on her finger suddenly felt heavy as she realized that David had proposed with someone else's house as collateral for their future happiness. Margaret's demeanor continued to evolve as she revealed more of her strategic thinking. She had kept the house in her name specifically because her grandmother had warned her about protecting her independence, she explained. The older woman had lived through her own difficult marriage and had insisted that Margaret maintain some financial security that couldn't be touched by anyone else's decisions or mistakes. Harold Pembroke began to find his voice as he realized his client had been hiding the strongest possible legal position behind a facade of helplessness. His earlier fumbling gave way to growing confidence as he understood that Margaret had been testing David's character rather than fighting a losing battle. The divorce settlement suddenly looked very different when the primary marital asset didn't actually belong to the husband. Victoria's desperation reached fever pitch as she realized the full scope of her miscalculation. She had spent 18 months carefully cultivating David, researching his assets, and positioning herself as the perfect replacement for his unsuitable wife. Every calculation had been based on assumptions that were proving devastatingly wrong. The wealthy lifestyle she had been counting on was evaporating like smoke. David's earlier arrogance completely collapsed as he began to understand his actual position. Without the house, his net worth was significantly smaller than he had represented to Victoria. His investment portfolio was substantial, but not enough to support the lavish lifestyle Victoria expected. The lake house he had promised her was mortgaged to the maximum, and his business had been struggling more than he had admitted to anyone. Mr. Henderson methodically laid out the legal reality with devastating precision. Margaret could, if she chose, demand that David and Victoria vacate the property immediately since they were essentially trespassers with no legal right to remain. The belongings Victoria had moved into the master suite were there without the owner's permission, and any renovations or changes to the property would require Margaret's explicit consent. Victoria's final desperate gambit was to demand legal action against Margaret for fraud and deception. She accused Margaret of deliberately hiding the truth about property ownership to entrap David in a marriage under false pretenses. Her voice cracked with hysteria as she insisted that someone had to pay for the devastation of her carefully laid plans. Margaret's response was delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had endured months of humiliation and emerged victorious. She pointed out that she had never claimed David owned the house, had never transferred the property to his name, and had never hidden any documents. The assumptions had been made by others without consulting her or examining the actual legal records. She had simply allowed people to reveal their true characters by making their own assumptions. The conference room fell into stunned silence as the complete reversal of power became undeniable. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her perfect makeup streaked with tears of rage and disbelief. David slumped forward with his head in his hands, finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. Margaret sat calmly with her hands folded, no longer the victim, but clearly the person in control of everyone's fate. Mr. Henderson began preparing new documents that would reflect the actual ownership situation, his professional demeanor unchanged despite having witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals of his long career. The settlement that had seemed so generous to David and Victoria minutes earlier now looked like what it actually was: Assunta Beek's wife's mercy toward people who had shown her none. Margaret's voice carried a steel core as she began revealing the full extent of her preparation over the past year. She had not only suspected David's affair, she explained calmly, but had hired a private investigator to document every hotel meeting, every romantic dinner, and every lie David had told about working late. The evidence filled 3 thick folders that she had kept locked in a safety deposit box that David didn't even know existed. Victoria's face went ashen as Margaret continued her methodical revelation. Every cruel word Victoria had spoken that morning had been recorded on Margaret's phone, she announced, pulling the device from her purse with quiet satisfaction. Every plan to gut Margaret's carefully chosen decor, every dismissive comment about Margaret's worth, every detail of Victoria's gold-digging strategy was now preserved for posterity. The private investigator's report made for fascinating reading. Margaret continued with devastating calm. Victoria's real name was Victoria Castellanos, and she had targeted 3 other wealthy married men in the past 5 years using exactly the same strategy. The country club meetings, the intellectual conversations, the perfectly timed availability during lonely business trips. It was a practiced routine that had netted her significant settlements from 2 previous relationships. David's world continued crumbling as Margaret revealed that she had been tracking their finances throughout the marriage more carefully than he had ever realized. His business accounts, which he thought were private, had been under her quiet scrutiny since she first noticed unexplained charges for expensive restaurants and hotel rooms. She had discovered that his company was leveraged far beyond what he had ever admitted, even to his own attorney. Victoria's hysteria reached new peaks as she processed the implications of Margaret's strategic thinking. Not only had all her belongings been moved into a house that didn't belong to David, but Margaret could have her arrested for trespassing at any moment. The master bedroom suite that Victoria had claimed as her territory was actually an illegal occupation of someone else's private property. Margaret's transformation from victim to victor was now complete and undeniable. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had been underestimated by everyone in the room and had used that advantage to devastating effect. She informed Victoria that she had exactly 24 hours to remove all personal belongings from the house, after which anything remaining would be considered abandoned property. Harold Pembroke was experiencing his own transformation as he realized his client had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Margaret had retained him specifically because his bumbling exterior would convince David's team that she was poorly represented, when in reality, she had been consulting with top-tier attorneys throughout the entire process. His apparent incompetence had been carefully orchestrated theater. Victoria's desperation manifested in increasingly wild threats of legal action. She would sue for emotional distress, she screamed. She would claim that Margaret had deliberately deceived everyone about property ownership. Her threats grew more elaborate and less coherent as she grasped for any strategy that might salvage her devastated plans for the future. Mr. Henderson calmly informed Victoria that her threats held no legal merit whatsoever. Property ownership was a matter of public record, easily verified by anyone who bothered to check. The failure to perform due diligence was not Margaret's responsibility, and threatening the actual property owner could potentially result in criminal charges for intimidation and harassment. Margaret revealed another devastating detail with surgical precision. The expensive jewelry that David had been showering on Victoria, including her 3-carat engagement ring, had been purchased using credit cards that were secured by the house as collateral. Since David had never owned the house, those credit lines were technically fraudulent, and the debt collection process would begin immediately. David's financial house of cards became more apparent as Margaret continued her revelations. The lake house he had promised Victoria was mortgaged for more than its current market value. His investment portfolio consisted largely of high-risk ventures that were currently losing money. Even his luxury car was leased rather than owned, and the payments were behind by 2 months. Victoria's mind raced through the mathematics of her disaster with calculating speed despite her emotional breakdown. 18 months of careful cultivation had not only failed to secure her future, but had actually left her worse off than when she started. She had given up her apartment, her job, and her independence for a fantasy that had never been real. Margaret's strategic thinking extended beyond just protecting her assets. She revealed with quiet satisfaction. She had been documenting Victoria's spending patterns and lifestyle inflation over the past year, creating a detailed record of someone living beyond her means while planning to steal another woman's home. The evidence would make fascinating reading for any future Mark Victoria might attempt to target. The prenuptial agreement that David had insisted Margaret sign became another weapon in Margaret's arsenal. Since the house wasn't marital property, the agreement that was supposed to protect David's assets actually protected Margaret's ownership while leaving David with minimal claims to anything else. His attorney's supposed thoroughness had created a trap for his own client. Victoria's social media presence, which she had carefully curated to showcase her luxurious lifestyle with David, now stood as evidence of her deceptive practices. Margaret had screenshots of every post where Victoria had claimed ownership of spaces and belongings that had never been hers. The digital evidence trail was comprehensive and damning. Harold Pembroke found his voice as he began to understand the brilliance of Margaret's strategy. She had allowed David and Victoria to construct their own fantasy while gathering evidence of their true characters and intentions. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every plan to erase Margaret's existence from her own home had been carefully documented and preserved. Mr. Henderson began preparing eviction notices with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the proceedings. As the actual property owner, Margaret had every right to determine who could and could not remain in her home. The 24-hour notice was actually more generous than required by law, he explained, since Victoria had no tenant rights whatsoever. Victoria's final desperate appeal was directed at David, begging him to fix the situation somehow. Her voice cracked with genuine desperation as she reminded him of all their plans, all the promises he had made about their future together. The sophisticated socialite who had entered the conference room that morning was completely gone, replaced by someone facing the complete collapse of her carefully constructed world. David's response was the final nail in Victoria's coffin. His voice was hollow as he admitted that he couldn't fix anything because he had never actually owned what he had promised her. His business was failing, his debts exceeded his assets, and without the house as collateral, he couldn't even maintain his current lifestyle, let alone support Victoria's expensive tastes. Margaret stood gracefully, gathering her documents with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. She informed the room that her attorney would be in touch with new settlement terms that reflected the actual ownership situation. David would receive exactly what he had contributed to the marriage, which was considerably less than anyone had assumed. The conference room that had echoed with Victoria's triumphant laughter just hours earlier now felt like a mausoleum for her shattered dreams. Margaret moved toward the door with quiet dignity, leaving behind a tableau of devastation that would haunt everyone present for years to come. Her final words were delivered with the authority of someone who had endured the worst and emerged victorious. She thanked Victoria for showing her exactly who David really was underneath his charming exterior. The past year of humiliation and betrayal had been painful, but it had also been educational. Margaret now knew that she deserved better than either of them could offer, and she was grateful for the clarity their cruelty had provided. The door closed behind Margaret with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel falling. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, staring at the space where her future had been just moments before. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Victoria's designer world crashing down around her in irreparable pieces. Victoria's final desperate plea to David echoed through the conference room like a death rattle. Her voice broke as she begged him to find some way to fix this catastrophe, to somehow make good on all the promises he had made about their luxurious future together. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched at his sleeve as she reminded him of the designer wedding dress already ordered, the honeymoon reservations in Italy, the life they had planned down to the smallest detail. David's admission came in a voice hollow with defeat. He couldn't fix anything, he confessed, because there was nothing left to fix. The revelation about the house ownership had exposed the fundamental lie underlying their entire relationship. Without Margaret's property as collateral, his true financial position was revealed as far more precarious than he had ever admitted, even to himself. The business ventures that David had boasted about were hemorrhaging money, he finally acknowledged. The investment portfolio that had impressed Victoria existed largely on paper, tied up in failing startups and risky commodities that were currently worthless. Even his country club membership was behind on payments, and his lease on the luxury sedan would expire next month with no funds to renew it. Margaret's gracious offer of 24 hours to collect belongings was more mercy than Victoria had shown her that morning, Mr. Henderson observed with professional detachment. The law would have allowed immediate eviction of trespassers, but Margaret's character was evident in her willingness to provide reasonable time for Victoria to salvage what remained of her shattered plans. Victoria's public breakdown reached its crescendo as she realized that everyone she had tried to impress over the past 18 months would soon learn the truth about her spectacular failure. The social circle she had cultivated through her relationship with David would discover that she had been living a fantasy built on lies and assumptions. Her reputation as a sophisticated socialite would be replaced by whispers about the gold digger who had been outwitted by the quiet housewife she had dismissed so cruelly. Harold Pembroke's transformation continued as he revealed the additional legal protections Margaret had quietly put in place. She had established a revocable trust that would protect her assets from any future claims, updated her will to ensure her property would go to charitable organizations rather than anyone who might contest it, and even secured restraining orders that could be activated immediately if either David or Victoria attempted to harass her. Victoria stormed from the conference room in a hurricane of designer fury, her exit accompanied by threats that fooled no one and promises of revenge that rang hollow in the face of her complete legal powerlessness. Her red-soled heels clicked frantically against the marble floors as she fled toward an uncertain future with nothing but her pride and a suitcase full of borrowed dreams. Mr. Henderson completed the proper divorce documentation with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work would stand up to any legal scrutiny. The new settlement reflected the actual ownership situation, leaving Margaret with her rightful property and David with exactly what he had brought to the marriage 23 years earlier, which was considerably less than anyone had assumed. David's pathetic attempts at reconciliation began before Victoria had even reached the elevator. His voice carried the desperation of a man who finally understood what he had lost in his pursuit of what he thought he wanted. He begged Margaret to consider the years they had shared, the life they had built together, the possibility of starting over without Victoria's toxic influence poisoning their relationship. Margaret's response was delivered with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of humiliation and betrayal. She informed David that he had already made his choice when he decided that 22 years of marriage was worth less than 18 months of excitement with a calculating stranger. The man she had loved no longer existed, if he ever had, and she had no interest in trying to resurrect someone who had been willing to discard her so callously. 6 months later, the transformation in everyone's circumstances was complete and irreversible. Victoria had been forced to move back in with her parents in suburban Toledo, her designer wardrobe packed away in childhood bedroom that still featured the pink wallpaper from her teenage years. The sophisticated socialite persona had been abandoned in favor of a desperate job search that yielded only entry-level positions that barely covered her credit card minimums. David's new reality was a studio apartment in a converted warehouse district, furnished with items from discount stores and thrift shops. His business had finally collapsed under the weight of its leveraged investments. and his bankruptcy filing had been covered in the local business journal with the kind of detail that ensured no one in his former social circle would miss the news of his spectacular fall. The luxury sedan had been repossessed 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, leaving David with a 10-year-old compact car that rattled when he drove past the country club where he could no longer afford membership. His former colleagues avoided him at business functions, unwilling to be associated with someone whose judgment had proven so catastrophically flawed. Victoria's attempts to reconnect with her previous marks had been met with restraining orders and cease-and-desist letters. Word of her spectacular failure with David had spread through the networks of wealthy, divorced men, making her persona non grata at the exclusive venues where she had once hunted for her next target. Her reputation was now that of a cautionary tale rather than an available opportunity. Margaret's house underwent a renovation that reflected her own tastes for the first time in over 2 decades. The country kitchen that Victoria had planned to gut was expanded and updated while maintaining its warm, welcoming character. The reading nook became a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the garden bloomed with flowers that Margaret had always wanted but David had considered too common for his status. The dinner parties Margaret hosted in her renewed home were filled with genuine friends who had supported her through the difficult months of her marriage's dissolution. These were people who valued her kindness and intelligence rather than her property values, who brought homemade desserts rather than calculating social agendas, who stayed late into the evening discussing books and ideas rather than investment opportunities and social climbing strategies. Victoria's drives past the house became a weekly ritual of self-torture that she couldn't seem to abandon. The property that she had planned to transform into a showcase for her sophisticated taste was now blooming with cottage gardens and welcoming touches that spoke of genuine happiness rather than calculated display. The sight of Margaret's contentment was a daily reminder of how completely Victoria's plans had backfired. Margaret's charitable work expanded to include counseling other women who had discovered infidelity in their marriages. Her experience had taught her valuable lessons about protecting oneself while maintaining dignity, about the difference between genuine love and calculated manipulation, about the strength that comes from being underestimated by people who mistake kindness for weakness. The final chapter in Victoria's downfall came when she was arrested for credit card fraud related to purchases made during her relationship with David. The expensive jewelry and designer clothes she had accumulated using cards secured by property David didn't own constituted a felony that would follow her for years. Her booking photo, showing a woman whose desperation had finally overwhelmed her calculation, became a cautionary tale shared in social media groups dedicated to exposing predatory dating behavior. David's last contact with Margaret came in the form of a letter that arrived on the anniversary of their divorce. His handwriting, once confident and bold, now appeared shaky and uncertain as he attempted to apologize for the pain he had caused. He admitted that losing her had been the worst mistake of his life, that Victoria had never been worth sacrificing their marriage, that he would spend the rest of his life regretting the choices that had cost him everything that truly mattered. Margaret's response was brief and final. She thanked David for the letter, but explained that forgiveness was something she had given herself, not something she owed to him. She had moved forward into a life filled with genuine happiness and meaningful relationships, and she had no interest in revisiting the pain that his betrayal had caused. The chapter of her life that included him was closed permanently, and she wished him well in finding the peace that could only come from accepting responsibility for his choices. The house on Maple Ridge Drive continued to thrive under Margaret's loving care, its gardens blooming with renewed vitality, and its rooms filled with the laughter of people who appreciated beauty for its own sake rather than its social media value. Victoria's cruel predictions about Margaret's inability to maintain such a property had proven as wrong as everything else about her character assessment. Justice had been served not through revenge or cruelty, but through the simple revelation of truth and the natural consequences that followed. Margaret's quiet dignity had triumphed over Victoria's calculating manipulation, and genuine character had proven more valuable than superficial charm. The story served as a reminder that assumptions based on appearances could be devastatingly wrong, and that underestimating someone based on their kindness was a mistake that could have permanent consequences. Margaret's final victory was perhaps the sweetest of all. She had not only survived the betrayal and humiliation, but had emerged stronger, happier, and more authentically herself than she had been in decades. The woman who had been dismissed as weak and disposable had proven to be the strongest person in the room, and her quiet triumph resonated far beyond the mahogany conference room where it had all begun.